Griffin Kade and Jonah Mad Jack Wexler had once ridden side by side, bound by blood, loyalty, and the brotherhood of the Hells Angels. But inside the brutal walls of Blackridge Penitentiary, loyalty was nothing more than a forgotten promise. While Griffin rotted in a cage, betrayed by the very men he had built into legends, Mad Jack ruled the streets, cutting deals with old enemies and erasing Griffin's name from the club's history. But Griffin wasn't the kind of man to be erased. He had spent his life taking what he wanted, and even in prison, he was about to remind everyone, including Mad Jack, why he was the most feared outlaw to ever wear the patch, Griffin Devil's Wolf. Kade had always lived by his own rules. Born into chaos, he had spent his life carving a path through the world with violence and fear. As the president of one of the most feared Hells Angels chapters in the country, his name carried weight in every bar, back alley, and highway across multiple states. He had built an empire on the back of blood and asphalt, running drugs, weapons, and whatever else kept the cash flowing. But the law had been closing in for years. And when the feds finally had enough to take him down, they made sure he would never see the outside world again. The day Griffin arrived at Blackridge Penitentiary, the air inside the prison shifted. Every man in that facility had heard his name, and those who hadn't would soon learn. The guards stood a little taller, their hands gripping their batons tighter. The inmates whispered, some excited, others nervous. He wasn't just another convict being thrown into the system. He was a living legend stepping into a new kind of battlefield. As he stepped off the transport bus, shackled wrists and ankles forcing his usually confident stride into a slow, deliberate walk, he scanned his new home. Towering concrete walls stretched toward the sky, topped with razor wire that gleamed under the midday sun. The air was thick with sweat, desperation, and the unspoken rules of survival. This was not a place for the weak. The guards processed him like they had 1,000 other inmates before. Stripped of his clothes, his belongings, and his freedom, he stood under the cold spray of a delousing shower, his body covered in faded tattoos telling the story of a man who had walked through fire more times than most. The ink on his skin marked him as Hells Angels royalty, a fact that did not go unnoticed. Once dressed in the standard orange jumpsuit, he was escorted through the main cell block. The walk was slow, purposeful. He could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him, sizing him up. Some were filled with curiosity, others with open hostility. Rival gangs had already staked their claim to different sections of the prison, and Griffin's arrival threatened to upset the fragile balance they had created. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla family, and the Mexican Mafia all ruled different parts of the facility, their leaders controlling everything from contraband to protection. Griffin was a wild card, too dangerous to ignore, too powerful to recruit without consequence. The gangs would either try to bring him into the fold or eliminate him before he became a threat. As he reached his assigned cell, he glanced at his new surroundings. A thin mattress on a metal frame, a rust-stained sink, and a toilet barely bolted to the floor. He had spent nights in worse places, but what mattered now wasn't comfort, it was control. He wasn't a man used to following rules, and he wasn't about to start now. Outside the cell doors, the yard was alive with tension. Men grouped together by race, by loyalty, by necessity. Some worked out in the heat, others stood watchful, against the fences, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness in their enemies. A few stared at Griffin, waiting to see what he would do next. The guards, too, were watching. Some of them saw Griffin as a prize, a trophy they had finally managed to put behind bars. Others knew what he was capable of and understood that his presence meant trouble was coming. Blackridge had its own set of rules, ones that weren't written down in any handbook. Griffin had spent his life breaking rules, but here he would need to learn them fast, because in a place like this, only the strongest survived. And Griffin Kade had no intention of dying in a cage. Within days of his arrival, Griffin Kade made his presence known. In prison, respect wasn't given. It was taken. The moment he set foot in the yard, every gang had their eyes on him. waiting to see whether he would align himself with one of them or try to stand alone. Most new inmates were either recruited or broken. Griffin was neither. He had ruled the streets, and he had no intention of bending to anyone here. It didn't take long for the first challenge to come. A member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a heavily tattooed enforcer named Troy Beckett, took it upon himself to test Griffin's strength. The Brotherhood controlled a large part of the prison's operations, and they didn't like unknown factors in their territory. Beckett was a seasoned fighter, known for his brutality, and he thought that Griffin was just another man trying to make a name for himself. The confrontation was quick, brutal, and decisive. As Griffin walked across the yard, Beckett blocked his path, issuing a silent warning. The air grew thick with anticipation, inmates watching from the edges, guards standing ready in case things got out of hand. Without hesitation, Griffin struck first. His fists moved like hammers, landing with a force that sent Beckett staggering. The fight turned into a bloody brawl, but it was over before the guards could intervene. Beckett lay on the concrete, barely conscious, his face unrecognizable. The message was clear. Griffin wasn't here to be anyone's pawn. The yard fell into a hush as inmates exchanged glances. Some were impressed, others wary, but one thing was certain. He had just painted a target on his back. Word spread fast through the prison. The Brotherhood wouldn't let the attack go unanswered. The Black Guerrilla family and the Mexican Mafia took notice too, weighing whether Griffin was worth recruiting or eliminating. He had no alliances, no protection, and yet he had already challenged one of the most powerful gangs inside Blackridge. The warden, Elias Mercer, watched the unfolding chaos with measured interest. Mercer had seen all kinds of criminals pass through his prison, but Griffin was different. He wasn't just another gang leader. He was someone who could shift the entire balance of power within these walls. Mercer knew that men like Griffin either burned out quickly or became something even more dangerous. For now, he let things play out, curious to see how far this new force would go. Inside the cell block, tension rose. Griffin moved with purpose, never showing hesitation, never letting his guard down. The Brotherhood wasn't going to let the incident in the yard slide. Late one night, 3 men entered his cell, armed with shanks, their faces cold with intent. They expected him to be asleep, unaware. They were wrong. The fight that followed was brutal, silent, and efficient. By the time the guards responded, 2 men were bleeding on the floor, groaning in pain, while the third stumbled away, clutching his side. Griffin stood unscathed, his breathing steady. The attack had failed. From that moment on, the prison's power structure began to shift. Griffin had made it clear that he wasn't going to be an easy target. The gangs debated their next move. Some wanted to take him down before he grew stronger. Others considered bringing him into the fold, seeing potential in his strength. The guards were on edge, knowing violence was inevitable. The warden, still watching, saw an opportunity. If Griffin was going to rise to power, he would have to be controlled or destroyed. But Griffin wasn't waiting for anyone to decide his fate. He had already started making his own moves. Griffin Kade had spent his life leading the Hells Angels, building a criminal empire that stretched across states. But in Blackridge Penitentiary, power wasn't measured in miles of open road or the roar of motorcycles. It was determined by alliances, betrayal, and blood spilled on the cold prison floors. Inside these walls, he was on his own. He had no crew to back him up, no loyal brothers to enforce his rule, or so he thought. It wasn't long before whispers from the outside made their way to him. Through the prison's underground network, messages traveled faster than any official communication. The words reached Griffin in a folded scrap of paper, passed through a network of inmates who owed him nothing but feared him enough to comply. The message was short and brutal. His old chapter had turned their backs on him. The club he had built from nothing was now under the control of another man, Jonah Mad Jack Wexler. Mad Jack had once been Griffin's most trusted lieutenant, a man he had pulled from the gutter and shaped into a leader. But loyalty in their world was thin, and power made men hungry. With Griffin locked away for life, Mad Jack had wasted no time claiming the throne. Worse, he wasn't just running things differently, he was making deals with old enemies, men Griffin would have never trusted. Inside Blackridge, the betrayal burned deeper than any wound. The Aryan Brotherhood, the same gang that had tried to take him out, was now working with what was left of his Hells Angels chapter. Griffin wasn't just abandoned, he had been sold out. His former brothers were funneling money, drugs, and weapons into the prison under the Brotherhood's protection. The men he once trusted had chosen survival over loyalty, aligning themselves with the very people who wanted him dead. The realization made the walls of Blackridge feel even smaller. He wasn't just fighting against the prison's established order, he was fighting against his own past. He had built a reputation that made men fear him, but now that reputation was working against him. Every gang in the prison saw him as a wild card, a problem that needed to be solved before he could rise too high. The Aryan Brotherhood wanted revenge for what happened in the yard. The Black Guerrilla family and the Mexican Mafia were watching closely, weighing their options. Griffin knew he had to act before they did. He wasn't a man who waited for trouble to come knocking. He had spent his life staying ahead of the game, and he wasn't about to let his enemies dictate his fate. The first thing he did was take stock of the men around him. In every prison, there were outcasts, men who had no real allegiance, men who had been discarded by their own groups. He started small, observing, listening. Some inmates were sick of the Brotherhood's control. Others had been used and discarded by their own gangs, left to fend for themselves in a place where survival meant choosing a side. Griffin gave them another option. Not through promises, not through words, but through action. When a man from the Brotherhood tried to corner an inmate who owed them a debt, Griffin stepped in. The fight was fast and violent, leaving the Brotherhood's enforcer unconscious in a pool of his own blood. It wasn't about saving anyone. It was about sending a message. The power in Blackridge wasn't as stable as the gangs believed. The cracks were already there. Griffin just had to widen them. The warden, Elias Mercer, saw what was happening. He had been waiting to see where Griffin would land in the prison's power structure, but now he realized the truth. Griffin wasn't looking to join the game. He was trying to rewrite the rules. Mercer had seen men like him before, and he knew how dangerous they could be. If Griffin wasn't stopped, Blackridge was going to become a war zone. But Griffin wasn't thinking about the warden. He wasn't even thinking about survival. He was thinking about the men outside these walls, the ones who had betrayed him. If he was going to take back what was his, he needed to do more than just survive. He needed to become something bigger than a legend. He needed to become a ghost. Griffin Kade had spent years ruling the streets. But now, inside Blackridge Penitentiary, he was rewriting the rules of power. He wasn't just another inmate looking for protection. He was a force carving out his own path. His fight with the Aryan Brotherhood had already sent shockwaves through the prison, but what came next would shake Blackridge to its core. With every move Griffin made, the balance of power inside the prison began to shift. The gangs that had once run things without question now had to consider a new factor: him. The Aryan Brotherhood was furious after their men had failed to take him out, and their leader inside, a lifer named Kane Richter, was losing patience. Richter wasn't used to seeing his orders ignored, and Griffin's survival was an insult he couldn't tolerate. In response, the Brotherhood tightened its grip, forcing weaker inmates into alliances, controlling more of the contraband flow, and increasing their numbers by recruiting fresh arrivals. But Griffin saw their desperation for what it was: a sign that they were afraid. They had expected to crush him quickly. And now that he was still standing, they were scrambling to reassert their dominance. Griffin knew fear when he saw it, and he used it against them. He didn't challenge them outright. Instead, he worked, in the shadows, identifying the cracks in their foundation. He started cutting off their influence where it hurt the most: money. In prison, money didn't come in the form of cash, but in trade, drugs, cigarettes, protection. Griffin began intercepting shipments, bribing low-level smugglers, and making sure that key transactions never reached the Brotherhood's hands. The first time one of their drug deals fell apart, they thought it was bad luck. The second time, they knew something was wrong. By the third, they were looking for someone to blame. And Griffin made sure their suspicions turned inward. Using the connections he had built among the outcasts, he spread rumors, subtle suggestions that there was a traitor among the Brotherhood's ranks. He planted doubt, letting paranoia do his work for him. It didn't take long before their own men started turning on each other, questioning loyalties and settling scores with violence. But the Brotherhood wasn't the only gang watching. The Black Guerrilla family and the Mexican Mafia had been biding their time, waiting to see how things played out. With the Brotherhood struggling, they saw an opportunity to take over parts of the prison they had never controlled before. Tensions escalated, and the warden, Elias Mercer, knew what was coming: a war. Mercer had allowed the gangs to maintain a delicate balance because it kept the prison under control. If one gang became too powerful, the others would rise to counter it. But Griffin had disrupted that system, throwing everything into chaos. The warden wasn't about to let one man turn his prison into a battlefield. One night, Griffin was pulled from his cell and taken to a private meeting with Mercer. The warden didn't offer him deals or threats. He offered him a choice. He could stop pushing, let things settle, and live the rest of his life in relative peace, or he could keep going down the path he was on and face the consequences. Griffin didn't need to answer. His choice had already been made. Days later, a riot erupted in the yard. The Brotherhood, desperate to regain control, launched a full-scale assault on the inmates they believed had turned against them. Weapons were drawn, blood spilled, and for the first time in years, Blackridge was thrown into absolute chaos. Griffin watched from the sidelines, his work complete. The war had begun, and he was the only one who knew how it would end. Blackridge Penitentiary was on fire, not with actual flames, but with chaos, bloodshed, and desperation. The riot that had erupted in the yard was just the beginning. The Aryan Brotherhood had launched their attack with full force, trying to stamp out any resistance and reclaim the dominance they felt slipping through their fingers. But they had underestimated how much damage Griffin Kade had already done from the shadows. The Black Guerrilla family and the Mexican Mafia, long content to let the Brotherhood rule unchecked, saw their chance. They struck back, turning what should have been a targeted attack into a full-scale war. Inmates clashed in the yard, in the cell blocks, even in the kitchens. Guards scrambled to contain the violence, but Blackridge had become a battleground, and no one, not even those in charge, could predict how it would end. Griffin had set the pieces in motion, but now he had to ensure the outcome went exactly as he planned. He wasn't interested in winning a war for the sake of power. He wanted revenge. The betrayal by his former brothers on the outside, the way the Brotherhood had tried to erase him, it all led to this moment. His moves had been precise, and now it was time for the final strike. In the confusion, Griffin made his way to one of the secure areas of the prison, the Brotherhood's stash spot. Every gang had one, a place where contraband was hidden away, where weapons, drugs, and money were kept safe from prying eyes. But Griffin had spent weeks gathering information, listening, waiting for the right moment. He had learned where the Brotherhood stored their supply, and now, in the chaos of the riot, he was going to take it from them. Slipping past the fighting, he reached the stash location in an unused section of the laundry room. The Brotherhood had chosen it because it was off-limits to most inmates, a place only their highest-ranking members had access to. But Griffin had arranged for that to change. Earlier in the week, he had paid off a desperate prison worker to, accidentally, leave a supply closet unlocked. Inside, he found exactly what he was looking for: bags of smuggled goods, weapons wrapped in cloth, and stacks of contraband that the Brotherhood relied on to control their empire. Without hesitation, Griffin set fire to it all. By the time the flames were noticed, it was too late. The Brotherhood's resources, everything they had used to maintain their grip on the prison, were gone. Their men were already outnumbered in the riot, and now, without their supply lines, they were finished. As the fire alarms blared, prison guards flooded the facility, cracking down on the violence with overwhelming force. Tear gas filled the air, batons swung, and inmates were dragged away in chains. Order was being restored. But for the Brotherhood, it was over. Their leadership had been wiped out in the riot, their enforcers weakened, and their power shattered. Griffin was taken into isolation, locked in a cell where the warden could keep an eye on him. Elias Mercer knew exactly who was behind the destruction of the Brotherhood, but he also knew there was nothing he could prove. Griffin had never been caught in a single act of violence, never been seen pulling the strings. He was just an inmate who had managed to survive. At least that's how it looked on paper. The power in Blackridge had shifted permanently. The Brotherhood was broken. The other gangs had gained more control, but none of them could claim full dominance. For now, there was balance. Griffin sat alone in his cell, listening to the quiet hum of the prison settling down after the storm. He wasn't done. His betrayal on the outside still needed to be answered. But inside these walls, he had proven something important. He wasn't just another inmate. He was the most feared man in Blackridge, and he was just getting started.